Hello and welcome to Politics Theory Other. My name is Alex Doherty and my guest today is Kevin Gray. In December of last year, the then South Korean president, Yoon Yeol of the right-wing People Power Party, attempted to impose martial law on the country in what was described as a self-coup, an event unprecedented in South Korean history since the country's transition to multi-party democracy in the late 1980s. In today's conversation, I spoke with Kevin about his recent article in the New Left Review on the Korean far right. We chatted about the background to the attempted coup and the history of the Korean far right and broader conservative currents. We talked about the far right's roots in the Japanese occupation of Korea and the role of the United States in supporting those conservative elements that collaborated in Japanese rule. And we discussed the efforts of modern conservatives to rehabilitate the image of South Korea's military dictators who ruled the country from the end of World War II until the democratic transition. Finally, we talked about how the far right has developed a capacity for large-scale militant street protest and why it is that young Korean men are increasingly supportive of the far right. If you find today's interview useful, then please consider becoming a £5 patron of the podcast. The show depends entirely upon listener support, and as well as keeping PTO going, you'll also get access to bonus content, such as the recent listener questions episodes with Richard Seymour. You can support the show in pounds or whatever your local currency happens to be, and you can pledge any amount you choose. Go to patreon.com/polltheoryother to sign up. Kevin Gray is a professor in international relations at the School of Global Studies at the University of Sussex. He's the author of Korean Workers and Neoliberal Globalization, Labour and Development in East Asia, Social Forces and Passive Revolution, and he's the co-author with Jong-Woon Lee of North Korea and the Geopolitics of Development. We spoke about his recent article in the New Left Review titled Old Wine in New Bottles, The Far Right in South Korea. So, Kevin, in your recent article on the South Korean right that appeared in the New Left Review, you write that there are important differences between the South Korean far right and its Western counterparts. Typically, it doesn't trade in nativist attacks on immigrants, nor populist denunciations of the political establishment. Rather than rejecting globalism, it regards the country's alliance with the US as a cornerstone of its identity. Instead of emerging as an outside challenger to the mainstream, its origins lie in the authoritarian bloc that governed the country for 40 years after World War II, running it as a frontline US ally during the Cold War. Indeed, its roots can be traced still further back, to the strata that collaborated with the imperial Japanese occupiers in the first half of the 20th century. To explain how the far right has come to figure as such a significant force in South Korean politics requires grappling with this history. So before we talk about more recent events and the extraordinary crisis that saw the attempted imposition of martial law by the then Korean president Yoon Yeol in December of last year, let's talk a bit about that history of the South Korean right, starting with the Japanese occupation of the Korean peninsula that lasted from 1910 until 1945 and Japan's defeat in World War II. So what did that social strata that collaborated with the Japanese consist of, and what were the economic and political interests that were represented in the sections of Korean society that collaborated in the Japanese imperial administration of Korea and the repression of Korean opposition to the occupation?
As I said in the article, this social cleavage that emerged during the colonial era I think it's really central to understanding what we're seeing today with the strong polarization between the right and what I would call the liberal progressive forces. So that social polarization in the colonial era occurred between, on the one side, you have those social forces, the minority of social forces that kind of collaborated with the Japanese. So I would say it's the landlords, who cooperated with the colonial authorities. It's the minority of Koreans who were able to establish businesses and collaborate with the authorities. And also, in particular, it's the bureaucrats. I mean, one thing that was very distinctive about the colonial project in South Korea, which differs from typical European colonies is that there was a great deal of state building. The colonial state that emerged in South Korea was actually quite huge for a colonial state. Around 40,000 Japanese colonial officials, but also tens of thousands of Koreans worked for that state. So you have this whole emergence of a bureaucratic class who were firmly embedded within the colonial state. And then, of course, you've got what you might broadly call the sort of security forces, the police, the military as well. And a lot of Koreans sort of willingly became part of the police and the military. And then on the other side, you've got the majority of the population, you've got the workers, you've got the farmers, you've got people who were explicitly sort of resisted the colonial order. So you've got the independence activists. And so this was a kind of a political division, a divide. It also became an economic one because those people who collaborated with the colonial state did quite well out of it in monetary terms. So this division is something that in 1945, when the country was liberated, it was something that shaped very strongly the post-liberation politics and had all kinds of sort of path-dependent impacts on the post-liberation socio-economic and political order.
And so I suppose one might imagine that with the defeat of the Japanese in 1945, that would have left the collaborationist Korean minority very isolated, bereft of domestic support, and that they would have been permanently discredited in the country and unable to have much influence in post-war Korea. But you describe in the article how the combination of the American role in the country in the immediate post-war moment and also the Korean War of 1950 to 53 served to help restore the power of conservative forces in South Korea. So can you talk about those dynamics and how anti-communism came to shield right-wing collaborationists from criticism and enable the right to defeat their domestic leftist opponents?
Yes. And so what you said, first of all, there about the isolation of the collaborator class and how they, in the immediate post-liberation era, they didn't really have a role. They were discredited, lacking any kind of historical legitimacy. So that's all true for the immediate weeks after the Japanese surrender. So at that time, as I say, the majority of the Korean population, they suffered greatly. They hated the colonial order, and many, farmers, for example, were dispossessed under this kind of Japanese colonial and collaborator coalition that expropriated the land from Korean peasants. So the political mood after August 15th in 1945 was for some kind of post-colonial justice to take place. The main political agenda was, how do you deal with the collaborators? How do you right the colonial wrongs that had taken place during those three and a half decades?
Yeah, so, a similar dynamic to what we see in post-war Europe, of course.
Yes, that's right. So in the 3-week period between liberation and the arrival of the American military forces in September 1945, what Koreans did is they established a whole set of kind of grassroots structures of governance, both at the local level and then subsequently at the national level. So you saw the emergence of what were called people's committees. These were organizations that emerged to basically govern the country, but also deal with this issue about the legacy of colonial era collaboration. In terms of their politics, there was a whole range of different sort of spectrums, if you like, within the country. Some were much more left-leaning. There were communists and socialists involved, but there were also centrists and also rightists who were sort of more on the nationalist end of the political spectrum. So these emerged, and then at the national level, you had the declaration of the Korean People's Republic, which was led by an individual called Yoon. And the program was about democracy and labor rights and other such progressive causes. Now, when the Americans arrived then, and they were confronted with these sort of nascent structures of governance, they were very suspicious of them because the program included things that, from a very anti-communist mindset, could be seen as communist. And actually, the Americans, when they arrived, they refused to work with these organizations. And instead, the United States military worked with what was known as the Korean Democratic Party, which consisted mainly of the landlords and the collaborator class. So from very early on, there was this kind of a repression under US auspices of the grassroots democratic kind of organizations and a kind of a restoration of this collaborator class.
Yes, again, a familiar dynamic from certain events in post-war Europe as well. I suppose the British in Greece being an obvious example, where treating liberated Greece if its territory to be sort of occupied and for the domestic liberation movements to be kept down. So in 1961, Park Chung-hee, a high-ranking officer and a one-time soldier in the army of Manchukuo, the Japanese puppet state that existed in northeastern China, seized power in South Korea in a military coup, and then embarked upon what you describe as an authoritarian developmentalist program that drove South Korea's economic miracle from the 1960s onwards, combining export-led industrialization and US geo-economic backing with severe wage repression. In 1979, Park was then assassinated by the head of the Korean Central Intelligence Agency, which led to Chun Doo-hwan seizing power, which then precipitated the notorious Gwangju uprising led by pro-democracy students in the southwestern city, which was then notoriously violently repressed by the Korean military and security forces, with thousands massacred. Chun Doo-hwan then remains in power as dictator until the pro-democracy movement in 1987 forces the regime into accepting free multi-party elections, which took place that year. Now, you describe in the article how in recent years the Korean right have sought to rehabilitate the image of the military dictatorship, and in particular the reputation of Park Chung-hee, something that is perhaps made easier by the success of Korea's developmental project that he initiated and that took Korea from being one of the poorest countries in the world to eventually being one of the wealthiest and most technologically advanced, as we see today. Could you talk about that rehabilitation effort and the other arguments that the right have made in order to rehabilitate Park Chung-hee and also other figures from the era of military dictatorship?
Yes, I mean, this really goes to the core of the identity and the legitimacy of the right in South Korea. I mean, just to go back to Park Chung-hee's background, he was, during the colonial era, an officer in the Japanese imperial military based in Manchuria. And this is kind of odd in the sense that now Park Chung-hee is celebrated as one of these great Korean sort of modernizers who oversaw the development and modernization and industrialization of Korea. Yet he has this kind of problematic past, which a lot of the dictator era political elites shared. And this created a huge legitimacy problem, not just for Park Chung-hee, but for all those who shared that kind of background. Now, under the sort of anti-communist authoritarian developmental state, the way that was dealt with was basically through red baiting and outright repression. So even very early on in the post-liberation era, there were those who tried to sort of question and tried to bring about some sort of justice against the collaborator class. But when people did that, they were labeled as communists. They could have been thrown in prison or even killed. There's a great deal of state violence during those years. So, in a sense, the collaborator issue was kind of swept under the carpet. The Cold War kind of discourse, the red baiting was used to basically deal with this lack of legitimacy. But then, when you have democratization, the conservatives, with all this problematic history, suffering a kind of legitimacy deficit, right? Because what the democratization movement was, it was an attempt to try to, in addition to just the basic goal of formal democratization, it was also about shedding light on Korea's very difficult past. So part of the democratization movement was about trying to, expose the history of state violence, the history of colonial era collaboration, and recognizing, the history of people like Park Chung-hee and their repression, particularly Chun Doo-hwan, as you say, in Gwangju. So from the 1990s and particularly from the 2000s, the conservatives have tried to legitimize themselves through presenting a reinterpretation of South Korea's modern history. And part of this has been, not being, in their view, shy about the history of people like Chun Doo-hwan, Park Chung-hee. I mean, Chun Doo-hwan is probably a little bit out of this because he was clearly a very sort of violent dictatorship, very, very difficult to resurrect his legitimacy in that respect. But there's kind of what's called a Park Chung-hee syndrome, and also Syngman Rhee, Lee Syngman, the first president of South Korea. Yeah, the conservatives are sort of trying to resurrect them as the great sort of heroes of modern Korean history. Park Chung-hee was the one who developed Korea, even somewhat ironically referring to him as bringing about South Korea's liberal democracy, even though, particularly in the 1970s, he was clearly responsible for instituting a dictatorship in South Korea. So I think this attempt to sort of resurrect and rehabilitate these leaders from the past is a manifestation of the legitimacy crises that the conservatives have faced since the democratization era.
And I suppose it makes a lot of sense to focus more on Park Chung-hee than Chun Doo-hwan, as you say, because of the extreme violence under Chun Doo-hwan, especially the Gwangju uprising. But I suppose also because the South Korean economic takeoff takes place under the rule of Park Chung-hee, an argument can perhaps be made that during his time in power, dictatorial authority was more necessary to respond to the legitimacy crisis represented by North Korea at a time when the North had a great deal more prestige than it did later, had a comparatively stronger economy, and I suppose also when the loyalty of the population of South Korea to the Southern regime was more in question.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. I mean, if you look at the kind of demographic support base of the right in South Korea today, I mean, a lot of it is based on the older generations. These are the people who lived through that era. So from the beginning of Park Chung-hee's rule in 1961 to when he was assassinated in 1979, I mean, South Korea underwent a very profound and rapid process of industrialization. And so these people remember that, and they see it as a time where Korea moved from underdeveloped, war-torn country to, in 1979, one of the successful miracle economies of East Asia. So this is not something that people would have felt necessarily about Chundu in the 80s, when, particularly in the early 80s, the South Korean economy was struggling, and as I say, it was a period of very, very harsh dictatorship.
I suppose also a very different dynamic from other American allies during the Cold War. So Latin American dictatorships, for instance, where those states simply weren't allowed to follow the same kind of path of development that South Korea could, partly because they didn't have the same geopolitical significance, South Korea being a frontline state, and the necessity of building up this kind of Japan-centered bloc that can face off against China and the Soviet Union.
Yes, that's right, yeah.
So elsewhere in the article, you describe how the clientelism of the South Korean government's development strategy led to some regions of the country being favoured with greater levels of investment than others, and that political allegiances based on that geography persist very substantially down to this day, with the southeastern provinces and the cities of Daegu and Busan remaining bastions of the right, whereas the relatively neglected southwest and Gwangju in particular became hotbeds of opposition to the dictatorship. Can you talk about those dynamics and how they've led to regional support for conservative forces looking quite different from the patterns that we see in some other countries, where support for the right, even if it's somewhat overstated, has increased in Rust Belts, the one-time centres of industrial development, whereas the centres of export-led development in South Korea remain conservative?
Yes, so I mean it is an interesting contrast to what we've seen in Europe and in the United States. And I think, part of it, one of the challenges we have when talking about South Korea is we're using concepts that have been developed in other parts of the world. Conservatives, some mainstream conservatives are sometimes distinguished from the far right, and with when we see populist projects like Trumpism and of course the Brexit campaign in the UK, the sort of geographical social bases are those areas that have done badly out of the whole process of globalization, if you like, the deindustrialized regions, the people who have lost out in those kind of processes. But in South Korea, and this is partly because those dividing lines between sort of mainstream conservatism and the far right are much more porous, and in some sense these terms are interchangeable because of the nature of South Korea's modern history. You see patterns of geographical support for the rightist project, which are a bit more like what we would see with sort of mainstream conservatism within the United Kingdom, for example. So the more affluent regions, and this is also partly, of course, that South Korea has. I mean, it's seen some deindustrialization to an extent, but nonetheless, those areas that support the right are the ones that historically, going back to the 60s and 70s, were favored during the process of state-led industrialization. This is partly a colonial legacy. So this is the Gyeongsang provinces in the southeast of the country. It's kind of like the corridor between Seoul and Busan, and then, of course, going on connecting to the Japanese economy. So that became relatively developed even during colonial times. But then within the Park Chung-hee government, and those individuals who came from the southeastern Gyeongsang provinces, they were overrepresented within that political class. So that's partly why there's a certain degree of favoritism. More recently, also the more affluent regions of Seoul as well. So the Gangnam districts.
Gangnam, of course.
Yeah, that's right. south of the Han River. That's also a very strong conservative support base. But and then the other side of that is the southeastern Chola provinces, North and South Chola provinces, and there they've typically been sort of sidelined within the process of state-led industrialization. And for political purposes, they've also been maligned by the conservatives during the Park Chung-hee era and of course going on beyond that, the Chon Do-han era. Kim Dae-jung was the key opposition sort of politician who came from the Chola province, and so there was a kind of a sort of anti-Chola discourse mobilized for political purposes that associated the southwestern Chola region with sort of left-wing revolutionary sort of tendencies. And the grievances amongst the people of Chola were, of course, affected by what you mentioned earlier, which was the Gwangju uprising and then the state-led massacre of Gwangju citizens, which created a great deal of resentment. So that, I would say, is probably the biggest cleavage in terms of the sort of the center-left and the right distinction within South Korea. There are other cleavages as well, but I still think if you look at voting patterns and support for particular political parties, that's still the most important one.
And therefore makes it harder to read off political preferences from mere socio-economic status, right?
That's true to an extent, yes. But nonetheless, I mean, one of the things we've seen recently is sort of the increasing support for the right amongst younger males. And
yes.
And there is a sort of a socio-economic background to that, although it's a little bit more complicated than taking those claims of disadvantage at face value.
So the authoritarian bloc which had dominated South Korea during the dictatorship, as you've touched on, it starts to experience various setbacks from the 1980s onwards. Despite the crushing of the Gwangju uprising, democracy is finally achieved in 1987. Again, as you've touched on, there's the emergence of the Minjung or People's History movement, which seeks to develop this kind of counter-history to the dominant narratives of the right. And then South Korea's developmental model and economic growth starts to hit the buffers as other so-called Asian tiger economies start to catch up. Then in 1997, the East Asian financial crisis hits at the same time as the liberal DPK party takes office, which then remains in power for a decade. And you argue that the policies that the Liberals adopted in the wake of the crisis exacerbated what you describe as a broad social malaise that then helped to reconstitute the power of the Korean right. What were those policies and what were their effects on South Korean society?
As you mentioned, I mean, what's distinctive about the Korean case is the fact that democratization sort of occurred almost at exactly the same point where the economic model of growth that had been adhered to for the last 3 decades had started to run its course. And that is partly about competition from elsewhere, from Southeast Asia, from China, starting to develop the kinds of industries that South Korea had developed and was dependent upon. It's also about internal changes as well. So with the process of industrialization in a sort of classic modernization theory fashion, you get the emergence of a strong working class, the emergence of a middle class. Wages start to go up. This process of simply relying on cheap labor is not really possible anymore. So the initial response...
And you get a relatively militant trade union movement as well, right?
Yes, that's right, which is also a part of the democratization process. It's about politics, but it's also about challenging industrial relations within companies, trying to bring about a form of economic democracy. So that process is going on. In the 1990s, the way that this is dealt with is basically through a process of globalization and financialization. So there's a liberalization of the fairly strict financial controls. Lots of speculative money enters the economy, and that creates the conditions for the economic crisis of 1997. And so when Kim Dae-jung, the opposition politician from the Cholla provinces, came to power, it was basically at the end of 1997, beginning of 1998, at exactly the same time that Korea has its huge economic crash and is subject to an IMF structural adjustment program. So from the outset, the liberal sort of progressive camp is kind of implicated in this process of IMF-mandated neoliberalization, particularly the flexibilization of labor. And then from that point, you see a huge polarization of the labor market, regular, secure, contracted jobs growth basically stalls, and you get the emergence of this huge contingent labor force from there. So most job creation from the 1990s, early 2000s then becomes these kind of low quality contingent jobs. So this is where you start to see increasing levels of social inequality emerging. There's resentment around this, and pretty much both the conservatives and the liberal progressive governments from this time are not really able to adequately deal with this. And it's an issue that's extended to today, as I mentioned, about the sort of the resentment on the part of younger people, younger voters.
Regarding North Korea, Liberal governments in the South have pursued what came to be known as the Sunshine Policy, this gradualist policy of increasing political engagement and cooperation with the eventual aim of reunification, whilst overtly at least respecting North Korea's economic system, rather than seeking to simply absorb North Korea into the South along the lines of the reunification of Germany, where the GDR was effectively abolished and just absorbed into the Federal Republic. Conservatives have been vehemently opposed to the Sunshine Policy and have sought to use it as a way to delegitimize liberals and the left by portraying their opponents as soft on communism, even to the point of, sort of outright treachery, the idea that liberals and the left are, working for the other side. Can you talk about the Sunshine Policy and how that conservative response then helped to lay the basis for Yoon's declaration of martial law last year?
Yes. So, the conservative sort of opposition to engagement with North Korea is, it's fairly straightforward on if we're talking in practical terms, in the sense that the liberals' engagement with North Korea hasn't really profoundly changed North Korea, and North Korea have gone ahead with the development of nuclear weapons. And their accusation is also that the sort of liberal engagement with North Korea is basically ignoring human rights issues, for example. And, it's these organization of these summits between liberal South Korean presidents and the North Korean leaders also don't seem to have, produced much. So
the conservative Korean right obviously have an excellent record on human rights historically, so they're well positioned to make that argument.
Yeah, this is the irony with the whole human rights discourse, because it's very difficult really for those who put human rights at the center, for them to actually kind of point to any particular successes that they've had. Whatever's happened really has been largely irrelevant to what takes place in North Korea. But so it's a sort of debate about policy, but it's also this issue of North Korea. Much more so, I think, than economic policy, for example. It really is the dividing line between the two political camps in South Korea. And again, this is why I think this longer term history is important, because this feature of South Korean politics goes back to the fact that the conservative political class really owe their political and economic position in South Korean society to that period of US intervention and US-led sort of state building, right? So for the Korean right, the US alliance is absolutely central. I would go as far as saying that the alliance with the United States is their highest political value above all else. And relations with North Korea, engagement with North Korea is seen as somehow threatening the US alliance. And it's not, I mean, relations with China recently also are criticized in the same way. But for all these reasons, in relation to North Korea, but also just the structure of political discourse that has these really, really strong Cold War overtones, these have just not gone away. They've not lessened over time. And so when you saw Yoon Yeol's declaration of martial law, I mean, in some sense, the language seems to be from the 1950s, right? He's talking about anti-state forces, pro-North Korean elements within the South Korean political system. But it's still remains, the key sort of go-to vocabulary and discourse with which the conservatives criticize the liberal progressives.
Do you think that it can be a bit tricky for outside observers to understand the situation, because there can be a tendency to apply a sort of Western Eurocentric view of the Cold War onto Asia? And I mean, you describe sort of the Cold War overtones that have persisted beyond the official end of the Cold War. But, obviously it could be argued that the Cold War never ended in Asia. The People's Republic of China is still there, regardless of its sort of ideological shifts and its turn towards the market. And the Cold War is sort of alive and well on the 38th parallel, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, even the term Cold War is a little bit Eurocentric in the sense that Asia had two very hot wars during those years, right, where millions died. So there is that to it. But I do also think that a Cold War lens, as I've been saying, it is not that revealing when we try to understand the dynamics of South Korean politics, that it is about this historical legacy. So it's typical within Western media representations of what's happening in South Korea to simply say Cold War and then stop at that. But it's about these deep kind of cleavages between these political camps, and the way that, the North-South division exists, it's there. That's not to say it doesn't, but it's also to say that this has just become simply the primary issue over which each side of the political divide in South Korea tries to delegitimize the other. So it's become a sort of a political weapon. And this is why it's just continually reproduced over time as well within the South Korean context.
Just sort of returning to the political timeline. So the Conservatives finally returned to power in 2008 with the elections of Lee Myung-bak and then his successor, Park Geun-hye, the eldest daughter of the dictator Park Chung-hee. And you argue that the eventual impeachment of Park Geun-hye and her removal from office in 2017 on corruption charges was really a key moment in the development of a right-wing street protest culture as protesters came out in support of her, when the streets had sort of hitherto been the preserve of the left. Can you talk about how this sets the scene for the increasing militancy of the right on the streets, which revealed itself perhaps with even greater force after Yoon's declaration of martial law last year, and how, more than just being the kind of organic expression of right-wing opinion, those demonstrations in 2017 were organised by groups that you describe as being parastatal?
Yes, that's right. So, I mean, when I first started traveling to South Korea in the 1990s, long before the days of K-pop and Korean culture overseas, South Korea tended to be known for its street demonstrations, labor protests, student protests. And these were sort of the protests of the left, of the pro-democratic movement as well. But this, as you say, this turning point of the protests around the impeachment of Park Geun-hye in the winter of 2016-2017 seems to be a real turning point. I mean, I should say that the bulk of the demonstrations there were sort of supporting the impeachment of Park Geun-hye. And I remember visiting these demonstrations at that time, and the pro-Park Geun-hye anti-impeachment protests were, even though they were the minority, they started to become more and more visible. They're referred to in Korean as the taegukgi protest because of the waving of the South Korean flag. So it's really from this time, actually, that the South Korean flag almost becomes a symbol of the right in Korea in terms of their mobilization and their street politics. You also see American flags being waved as well, which is quite odd, actually, really, when you think about a sort of, a right-wing movement waving the flag of another country. But then that goes back to this huge emphasis placed on the US alliance. And more recently...
Well, odder still, you mentioned the presence of Israeli flags dating from this point too.
Yes. And that was in the past, since December of last year, that was a very visible element as well. And this comes back to the strong participation of the kind of evangelical other countries' flags. Is not typically what we would see in these kind of sort of right-wing protests, but it's something very distinctive about the Korean context. So yes, I mean, you start to see this emerging, street politics emerge at that time. And in the background, there are these organizations that have been around for a long time, these sort of anti-communist organizations that receive funding from the state. Their origins are in the sort of the social campaigns, government campaigns of the Park Chung-hee era, but they're still around and they're still playing a role in financing these demonstrations. Yeah, so that's how it developed after the Park Geun-hye government, and then it's continued to develop during this period since the declaration of martial law last year.
So let's talk a little bit about the lead up to that declaration, or self-coup as it's sometimes described. So in 2017, Moon Jae-in of the Liberal DPK party wins the presidential election. His popularity soon erodes, in large part due to South Korea's housing crisis. And as you've described, the DPK starts to lose support amongst younger cohorts, especially younger men, to the Conservative People Power Party. And then in 2022, Yoon Yeol wins the presidential election with this wafer-thin majority. And in the article, you describe how the very politically inexperienced Yoon was rapidly embroiled in scandals, including a corruption scandal surrounding his wife, and that he was in hock to the hard-right Chungam clique. Can you say a bit about Yoon's time in office leading up to the declaration of martial law last year, and who exactly the Chungam clique are and what they represent?
Okay, so yeah, I mean, as you say, Yoon's win in 2022 was by no means decisive. It was a very narrow victory. It was a very negative campaign between him and Lee Jae-myung, and I think a lot of voters at that time were turned off by both of those candidates. But it's important to remember Yoon's background here. I mean, he was a prosecutor for most of his life, had very little experience in politics, and so he didn't really have much in the way of political acumen or political skills. It was by no means obvious from his time as a prosecutor that he was necessarily aligned with the rightist political camp, but as part of the process of...
I have to say, Kevin, this is all sounding weirdly relevant to the British situation.
Right, yes, exactly.
An inexperienced prosecutor, not much of a political hinterland, moves to the right.
Yes, exactly. Yes, I wasn't going to say that, but you're right. So
we
yes,
can look forward to a self-coup next year, maybe.
Okay, yes, yeah. So and because of that, he doesn't really, speak well to the people. He takes several actions which create a lot of sort of resistance, and his public approval rating declined very, very quickly. As you say, his wife Kim Gun-hee plays a big role in that because she had an extraordinary skill for getting involved in corrupt practices, whether it was stock manipulation or bribery, and because Yoon's popularity declined so quickly, the Conservative Party, at this time called the People's Power Party, did very poorly in the 2024 general elections. So Korea's got this sort of system where the presidential elections and the general National Assembly elections are not synchronized. Okay, so 2 years.
It's probably worth mentioning also that the presidential election, it's a one term, right? You can't.
That's right.
For a second term.
At the moment, and since the democratic transition has been limited to one term, so from April 2024, the Conservatives lose very badly within the National Assembly elections. And so from that point on, basically, Yoon Suk-yeol is a lame duck president. He's not able really to pass his own laws, but the massively empowered opposition, DPK, want to put forward bills that are investigating, for example, Yoon's wife's corruption. But all that Yoon is able to do is exercise his veto power. So the Democratic Party of Korea, they are able to play this kind of role of a spoiler, kind of impeding any attempts by Yoon Suk-yeol to pass laws. And the final straw seems to have been when the DPK opposed Yoon Suk-yeol's budget, and we can see that in the content of Yoon Suk-yeol's martial law declaration, where he's talking about the sort of the disruptive anti-state forces within the political system that are preventing him from basically doing anything.
And what about Yoon's regional policy? What position did he take vis-a-vis North Korea? And to what extent was that just conventional conservative policy in line with what we saw from Lee Myung-bak and Park Geun-hye, or was it distinct? Did it diverge?
So there's a great deal of continuity, actually, because Yoon Suk-yeol was in some sense a newcomer to politics. He relied a great deal on his sort of prosecutor allies, and he put his fellow prosecutors in positions of power. But that wasn't enough. So he had to rely on many of the people who had been staff under the Lee Myung-bak government, sort of more than a decade earlier, right? So there was a great deal of continuity. His foreign policy advisor was the same person from before, and Yoon Suk-yeol's policy towards North Korea, it was referred to as an audacious initiative, and the content of that policy was saying to North Korea, look, if you denuclearize, we will provide you a huge amount of economic support and aid and these kind of things. It's almost exactly the same proposal that was made by Lee Myung-bak more than 10 years earlier. And it failed for the same reason, in a sense, because what it was saying to North Korea is like, if you drop the cornerstone of your deterrent, we will assist you in the transition towards a capitalist market economy. Those are two things that North Korea do not want, right? They don't want to have a transition to capitalism because they've spent years trying to do the exact opposite and maintain a sort of a state-centered economy where they also have political control. But at the same time, it's very difficult to persuade North Korea to give up nuclear weapons when they look around the world and they say, well, actually, we don't want to end up like Gaddafi in Libya, or we don't want to end up like Ukraine. So it's kind of almost a policy which is just a complete non-starter. So that was the continuity. In the run-up to the martial law declaration, what's been revealed after the fact is that the Yoon Suk-yeol government, it appears very likely that it was actually trying to start some form of actual warfare with North Korea. So throughout 2024, there was this issue where sort of defector activists who reside in the South were sending these propaganda balloons across the DMZ to North Korea, and then North Korea was sending back these balloons that were sort of laden with basically rubbish. But then at one point, North Korea was complaining and making very serious accusations that South Korea had been sending drones to Pyongyang, which of course is completely illegal. And it looks very likely that this was done by the South Korean military in order to provide a justification for the martial law declaration. So one of the most serious accusations against Yoon Suk-yeol's self-coup, as you put it, is his apparent attempt to try to provoke a conflict with the North. So there's continuity, but obviously this particular event is a very distinctive feature of the whole martial law episode, and obviously a very serious one as well.
Just going back to the so-called deal that was offered to North Korea, this is something you touch on in the article, that the circumstances, for offering that deal now are in some ways, much less propitious than they were under Lee Myung-bak, right? Because we have this new Cold War dynamic. North Korea can look to China and Russia, perhaps to a lesser extent, and there isn't this same sense of North Korea's isolation in a unipolar world, which characterized North Korea's situation. Particularly the 1990s, right?
Yeah, and that reflects changes within North Korea. If we go back to the first sort of liberal progressive Kim Dae-jung administration, which came to power in 1998, I mean, this was a time when the North Korean economy was in a dire, economic situation. I mean, there was starvation, right? With the economic collapse of the 1990s, there was an acute need for aid, whether it was from South Korea or from other countries. But in the intervening years, I mean, the economy in North Korea has recovered to an extent, perhaps not to how it was in the early 1990s, but the situation has improved a great deal. But what it means is that there's not such a sort of an acute need for humanitarian assistance, and particularly not from South Korea, which has always been a politically sensitive issue for North Korea. So, yeah, things have changed. I mean, North Korea seems to have other options now with Russia. Since the COVID lockdown of 2020, North Korea has definitely become a more insular place. I mean, I know many people think of North Korea in that way, but at least in the sort of 2000s, the 2010s, there was a lot more, I think, in terms of trade and investments within North Korea. A lot of that is made difficult now with sanctions as well. And this is another issue that South Korea has had to face, in the sense that the kinds of economic cooperation it can do with North Korea now, much of it is made very, very difficult by the international sanctions regime.
If we come on to the actual imposition of martial law at the beginning of December last year, can you say a bit about the detail of what exactly occurred, what the stated justifications for the suspension of democracy were, and what, in your view, were the sort of the real drivers of the move to declare martial law?
Well, I think in terms of what Yoon Suk-yeol was actually thinking when this occurred, I mean, it was talking about the sort of the enemy within, right? The DPK was this kind of anti-state force. It was pro-North Korean. It was kind of ruining, it's a bit ironic that Yoon Suk-yeol put it in these terms, but was kind of impeding the liberal democratic system. And so martial law was needed to sort of save democracy, if you like. And so that was the immediate justification. I mean, I remember, when I got a sort of news headline flash on the phone, and I mean, my first reaction was that I just didn't believe it, right? South Korea is probably one of the most successful democracies, certainly in Asia, since the transition of the 80s, and nothing like this has happened for more than 4 decades, right? So that makes you wonder just how sort of deluded Yoon was in thinking that something that could have happened in 1961 or 1980 could actually happen in 2025, when South Koreans are extremely well connected. It's not just a case of shutting down a radio station or a TV channel, because everybody's connected through social media and these networks, which actually the South Korean government has no control over. So it seems deluded, but that's not to say it was a spur-on-the-moment decision. It appears that this coup was planned for quite some time. I realize now I didn't answer your question from earlier about the Chungang clique, which is kind of Yoon Suk-yeol's old boy network based on the school that he attended. But it looks like, his allies within this declaration of martial law, they were pretty much all part of this network. And this had been planned since late sort of 2023. And this network includes people particularly within the military, but also within the police. So his kind of co-conspirators in that regard. So that's the kind of how it came about. In terms of what actually happened, it was, again, we're used to thinking about sort of democratic backsliding, but it's just worth remembering that this was not backsliding. It was a full-blown suspension of democracy. And it involved the mobilization of the military and the police around the National Assembly. It involved deploying the police and security forces to the National Electoral Commission, which is tied up to these kind of conspiracy theories about electoral fraud, which follows very much the sort of the right-wing conspiracy in the United States. And, the trials and the investigations are still ongoing, but, there's a lot of evidence that has emerged to say that there were plans to arrest hundreds of politicians, unionists, lawyers, religious leaders, journalists. They even recovered sort of supplies of cable ties and baseball bats and masks, which were going to be used for the arresting of the electoral officials. And this is also where this evidence emerged that there was a plan to provoke a conflict with North Korea to try to justify a coup. So that's in terms of how it played out on the night. And then, as everyone will have seen, the South Korean public mobilized very, very quickly to the area around the National Assembly building. And again, this is another feature of South Korean politics, is the huge mobilizational capacity of the public, basically, which has happened at many points in South Korea's modern history to defend democracy. And then the opposition lawmakers were basically able to get into the National Assembly building and rescind the martial law declaration.
On that sort of fantastical quality to the coup and a misjudgment of the situation, do you think, therefore, that the Korean far right are not as great a threat to Korean democracy as their actions might at first indicate? Or do you think that the attempt to impose martial law could be seen as a kind of testing or experimentation, which might lay the basis for a much more concerted effort later on? Or do you think that for there to be any chance of success, it would actually really, really depend upon the outbreak of a conflict, a real conflict with North Korea, with all the legitimacy for repression that would enable?
I mean, I think we're not yet a year away from that declaration of martial law. And I think in that context, I would be wary of saying that the South Korean right are not a threat. I mean, I can't think of, it was a very worrying situation at the time. It looked like potentially the martial law attempt could have succeeded. I mean, we don't know. I think, there are various reasons why it didn't. I think partly that South Korea no longer has a military that's prepared to fire its own citizens is an important factor in explaining its failure. But nonetheless, I mean, this is not something that's really gone away, right? I mean, the way things that played out after the kind of rescinding of martial law suggests that, it is a real genuine crisis. So, back earlier this year in January and February, there was, as the investigations began, there was an attempt to detain Yoon Yeol, who at that time was kind of holed up in his presidential office. And the presidential security guards tried to prevent the Corruption Investigation Office and the police from arresting Yoon Yeol. So you get two arms of the government that are actually sort of fighting and resisting against each other, which is a constitutional crisis. So it's and even now, I mean, the judiciary is still, playing a very problematic role within South Korean society. And I would also say, that in comparison to 2017, when Park Geun-hye was impeached, there hasn't been a similar movement within the Conservative Party, the PPP, to kind of criticize and denounce Yoon. So what happened afterwards was that, I mean, partly because they really did not want to see Lee Jae-myung be elected, but there was an attempt to defend Yoon, and there was very little in the way of actually critiquing the whole martial law episode. And this is worrying, right? So you have a political party in South Korea, the opposition party, which seems to believe in the legitimacy of Yoon's martial law declaration. And, as I say, I mean, this is also based on a kind of broader underlying societal shifts as well, where there has been a shift to the right amongst parts of the population, particularly amongst young people as well. And these are not things that are going to be resolved. So there's not much evidence to suggest that the polarization of politics that led to the martial law declaration has in any way really gone away. It's still very present and serious.
On that point about the shift of young men towards the right of the political spectrum, so in Britain, Europe and North America, there's a lot of discussion about similar dynamics. And in some cases, that's clearly happening on a significant scale. In other places, the data doesn't seem as robust, and it seems that perhaps some of that talk is overdone. But in South Korea, it absolutely does seem to be the case. I mean, in the article, you point out that in the 2022 presidential election, 59% of men in their 20s voted for Yoon, whereas a solid majority of young women voted for the Liberal candidate. What explains this development in your view? And could you also say something about the position of women in Korean society, which has historically been very male dominated and there's, a huge amount of gender inequality in Korea?
Yeah, as you say, those figures kind of speak for themselves in terms of the voting patterns. The figures, just to be clear, the figures also suggest that it's not all younger men who have gone to the right. I think it's important to state that. But you could also see these trends in the protests that occurred just after the martial law declaration, in the sense that a large contingent of those protests against martial law were younger women, with the attendance by younger men very limited. So I think, it's like you say, it's a broader global trend. Within Korea, it's a result of, as I was saying, the kind of polarization of the labor market, the lack of good quality jobs, the male graduates failing to find work that is appropriate to their level of qualifications. It's also about property prices as well. So, the younger men are not able to get onto the property ladder, if you want to call it that. And in Korea, that creates all kinds of problems in terms of doing basic things like getting married and having families. So there's a kind of resentment around that. But I think I said earlier that, that is the resentment. But if we look at the actual hard facts, it is, as you say, even though there's been progress in recent years, it's a fairly male-centered, male-dominated society, in the sense that, if you look at the OECD gender pay gap, Korea comes out as the very worst amongst all the OECD countries. If you look at the gender division within the contingent irregular labor force, it's overwhelmingly women. So in terms of regular jobs, around 5% of regular jobs are men, where only about 35% are women. So that there is this kind of huge sort of discourse amongst younger men against feminism and the progress. They probably wouldn't call it progress, but in any case, the progress that's been made in gender equality. But these are fairly limited things. So in the past, if you went for a civil service exam, you would get extra points if you'd done your military service, which of course only men do. And that was abolished. You also had a family registration system where you could only be a head of the family if you're a male, and that's been abolished. So there have been certain kinds of measures, but nothing really fundamental that sort of aims at tackling these deep running kind of gender inequalities within Korean society. And this is amplified by, as it is everywhere else, by social media, by YouTube channels and the Korean portal Naver and things like that. And there's been these openly sort of misogynistic groups like Ilbe, in Korean it's called Ilbe, which is this online community of typically younger men who are very sort of anti-feminist and misogynistic. So this is something that's really sort of developed in the last sort of one or two decades. Yeah.
And Korea very much has its counterparts to internet influencers like Andrew Tate and so on.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So I emphasize these longer running historical factors, the failed decolonization, the impact of the sort of the Cold War and the authoritarian era. But more recently, you see these kind of developments that look a bit more similar to what we're seeing elsewhere. And that's also part about transnational connections as well, right? There are in the United States, for example, there are these these individuals like Gordon Chang and Morse Tan who are well integrated into these sort of far-right networks and are also trying to bring that kind of movement to South Korea, as well as influence Donald Trump and to make him sort of opposed to the current liberal Lee Jae-myung government.
So in June 2025, Lee Jae-myung, who you've just mentioned there, of the Liberal DPK, was elected president, seemingly drawing a bit of a line under the whole martial law incident. But as you've already said, Korea remains a highly polarized society with the division, the two sides relatively equal. And you point out that the defeat of the Conservatives was not as decisive as might be expected, given the extraordinary events of December last year and subsequently. So what's your opinion of the current government, and how do you see the future of both the South Korean right, but also the left and the Liberals?
Yeah, to start with the right, as I just said, they're not going away. They've not sort of unambiguously rejected the martial law episode, and their influence is continuing to expand. I mean, I've been reading reports where it says that the younger people, males who are the age where you did attend school, very much aligned with the right-wing worldview and avid consumers of these kind of right-wing YouTube channels and are exposed to these kind of views. So this is likely to remain influential. In terms of the current Lee Jae-myung government, I mean, as I said, there's been this history where the Liberal Democratic Party has been confronted with these huge socioeconomic challenges, the property prices, the neoliberal labor market. And they haven't really managed to tackle that, right? You know, the Moon Jae-in government, for example, when it came to power in 2017, had this policy of eliminating irregular work in public corporations, public organizations. But it didn't really budge at all. It was largely a failure. And so there's not much that I can see from the Lee Jae-myung government's policies that suggest that this time is going to be that much different. There are still attempts to try to deal with the property market. Not very much is being said on the labour issue, apart from some issues around industrial accidents, for example, and trying to hold companies account for that. And even in Lee Jae-myung's election campaign, he promoted this sort of election platform where he was saying that people shouldn't think of him as necessarily sort of liberal. In many respects, he wants to carry out conservative type policies, right? So, that may be part of the electioneering process, but on the other hand, I would say that I think, the Lee Jae-myung government has some really, really serious challenges, particularly the more geopolitical kind, right? The deepening new Cold War in Asia, if you want to call it that. He's trying to sort of situate himself in the middle, keeping friendly relations with Japan, although that looks like it'll be quite sort of difficult given the political changes in Japan recently. But also, the huge challenge of the Trump administration. Like many other places, Korea was confronted with this tariffs issue, which for an exporting nation like Korea is a really serious challenge. And it looked like they had made a deal, that Lee Jae-myung had made a deal with Donald Trump, but now the United States is making this demand for a kind of upfront monetary payment of, I think it's $350 billion US, which if the South Koreans tried to pay, it would cause an economic crisis. It's a kind of extortion. It's something out of The Sopranos, right? That Trump is making this demand. And then on the other side, Lee Jae-myung is trying to pursue diplomacy with North Korea, and there's a bit of a warming of ties with China as well. But it's a really challenging situation, and it's difficult to see to what extent Lee Jae-myung is going to be successful in really doing this, given the climate and the context that he's in. So obviously, I want him to do well. I want him to, achieve the domestic and the foreign policy goals that he set out. But I think it's going to be really difficult.
You've been listening to Politics Theory Other. If you've been enjoying PTO and finding it useful, then please do consider becoming a £5 supporter on Patreon. The show depends entirely on listener support, and if you sign up, you can access bonus content, including listener questions episodes with PTO guests. Go to patreon.com/polltheoryother to sign up. The show's music and graphic design is produced by Planet B Productions. Thanks as ever for listening. I'll be back soon.